So what we just saw here is in many ways a very familiar story. Non-violent critics of an authoritarian regime, thugs sent to beat them up one day in a restaurant, fake charges in a court to put them in prison, an international mobilization on their behalf, an effort to shame the regime that put such critics in jail, and in the end, they are set free. For those who lost 60 months of freedom in jail, this will always remain a sad story. And it will always remain bitter memories for friends, relatives, and compatriots who were supposed to be intimidated. But in a strange way, this particular story is also reassuring. Because our mechanisms worked. Shaming worked. It is clear what is right and wrong. And in the end, right prevailed. In 1961, an article appeared in the London Observer. It launched a movement that has transformed the world, and that is still with us, the international human rights movement. In this article, the author argued that there is a growing tendency across the world to disguise the real reasons upon which non-conformists are put in jail. And he wrote that this indicates that governments are by no means indifferent to the pressure of outside opinion, and that when opinion is concentrated on one weak spot, it can sometimes succeed in making a government relent. Now, the morality behind that article and this campaign which it launched was that every individual counts. The strategy was to make individuals known, to shame regimes, and its symbol became a lit candle. And the organization that grew out of this, which obtained the Nobel Peace Prize 15 years later, of course, was Amnesty International. In the 1970s, we entered the age of dissent, the age of Soviet and Central European dissidents. It was also the age of the Helsinki Final Act of Human Rights, about which the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger famously said, "Its human rights provisions might as well be written in Swahili for all I care." He was a realist. What did these words on paper really mean? But dissidents and Helsinki watch groups disagreed. They were created all across the Soviet Union and Central Europe. Charter 77, Václav Havel, a playwright, took the lead. And so new words appeared. Non-violence resistance, living in truth, the power of the powerless. Helsinki watch groups led to Human Rights Watch. And one of its founders explained that it is necessary to also challenge those who indirectly support human rights abuse, to mobilize against the financial, political and military backing, to focus on what he called the surrogate villains. And so a movement grew. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Reporters Without Borders, we've just seen the list, and many more. And today we have more human rights groups than ever, more conventions than ever, more human rights commissioners than ever. And we have the story of a great success, as Václav Havel himself put it later, the story of stubborn men who knock their head against the wall, and then the wall falls, and these men are crowned kings. It is the fairy tale story of the end of the Iron Curtain, when this man, released from prison in January 1989, becomes president in December, and others, Arpad Göncz in Hungary, Bronislaw Geremek in Poland, and of course the story of Nelson Mandela. Political prisoners who leave prison to become moral leaders in the transition in their countries. But here is the problem. Never trust in progress to be irreversible. The Inquisition was abolished centuries ago. So was torture. So was slavery. But they all came back in the 20th century, in Europe, in this city. And across town there are museums, the topography of terror, museums to the wall, museums to communist repression. Nothing can ever be taken for granted. And so now, in the 21st century, we see the return of political prisoners back in Europe. Amnesty International counts today around 40 prisoners of conscience in Europe. Almost half of them are in one country in Azerbaijan, then in Belarus, then in Russia, until recently in Ukraine. The problem has been spreading. George Orwell wrote in 1984 about the dangers of totalitarian language abuse, of capturing the vocabulary of human rights. He said that in the year 2050 we might all live in Oceania, and the language of Oceania will be Newspeak, where autocracy will be democracy and democracy autocracy, where black is white and white is black, where stolen elections and free and fair elections mean the same thing, where political prisoners are criminals and dissidents are hooligans. Well, this is actually what happened, this capture of language, at the beginning of last year in Strasbourg. The Council of Europe, one of the most respected institutions in the defense of human rights, set up on the foundation of the European Convention of Human Rights, had a vote. And this was the result, 125 to 79. It was a historic vote. Never in the history of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe have more people turned up to vote. So what was it that mobilized everybody to come? Well, it was to defeat this resolution. There's a resolution drafted by the rapporteur on political prisoners, Christoph Strässer, who is here with us. A resolution which outlined these things: review old cases, ensure there are no new cases of political prisoners, refrain from prosecuting participants in peaceful demonstrations, refrain from criminalizing the expression of political and religious views. Why would anybody, why would an institution created as a spiritual union of democracies reject such a resolution? Well, first, who defeated it? Here is a breakdown. All 18 Russian members turned up and voted against this resolution. All 10 Turks, all 9 Spaniards, all 9 Italians, a majority of Ukrainians from Yanukovych's part of the regions, and a majority from the United Kingdom, all from the Conservative Party, and from France. Those who lost and who voted for this resolution were all 11 German members, all 6 Swedes, all members of the Baltic states, most Swiss, Finns, and Norwegians. Why? I won't go into it here. We wrote a report on this, which you can find on the website. Let me talk here rather about the what followed after. The first reaction was by the Azerbaijani head of the delegation to that assembly. This is what he said: the rapporteur, Mr. Strässer, has to accept that the Council of Europe belongs to Azerbaijan and not to him. What followed was a wave of arrests. Not all votes in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe have consequences. This one did. From March onwards, there was a wave of arrests like this one of Rashadat Akundov, a youth activist, and many others. But what was interesting was, from now on, these arrests were carried out without any sense of shame. The prisoner carousel, where people would be arrested and then released when there was enough pressure, as in the case of Emin Milli and Adnan Hajizadeh, who we had at the very beginning. This prisoner carousel stopped turning. In fact, now people were arrested and sentenced no longer to 2 years, but to 5, 6, 8 years in prison. And it also, the focus changed of who was targeted. The regime in Azerbaijan no longer cared about arresting people who actually worked for the Council of Europe. Look at these two individuals. Ilgar Mammadov, an opposition politician, was also the head of the School of Politics, a Council of Europe project to promote democracy. By arresting him a few weeks after this resolution was defeated, the regime sent a very strong signal of what it meant that the Council of Europe now belongs to Azerbaijan. And in the same year, Anna Mamadli, the most respected independent election observer, was also arrested. He had been, and this really put the finger in the eye of the Council of Europe, he had also been an advisor to Mr. Strässer on the resolution of political prisoners. How more can you show that you are beyond being shamed, that you no longer care about being regarded as dishonorable, than arresting and sentencing to long prison sentences since the very people who in your country had worked for the Council of Europe? Well, what has happened since to shaming? Let me show you one more clip. Oh, sorry, tone again.
Mama. Second question. Last time you were here in Brussels, you said that there are no political prisoners in Azerbaijan. Mr. Mamadov and Mr. Mamadli are still in jail. Do you still maintain that this is a fact, that you don't have political prisoners? Thanks.
Yes, of course, and this also is confirmed by the decisions of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Last December there was a broad discussion in the Council of Europe about this issue, and the resolution which was launched by some members of the Assembly with respect to the issue of political prisoners in Azerbaijan failed. The majority of Assembly did not support that resolution. And actually that means that what I said last time here in the European Commission, that there are no political prisoners in Azerbaijan, is also confirmed by one of the most important institutions of Europe and of the world. Azerbaijan is a member of the Council of Europe for more than 10 years. We are members of the European Court of Human Rights, and a priori there cannot be political prisoners in our country. If somebody is treated in a not a fair way, there is always a chance to apply to the European Court, and we are complying with the decisions of the European Court. And also I'd like to say that there are no definitions of political prisoners. We think that the definition of political prisoners, if adopted by the European Parliament or by the Council of Europe, would be a good idea. Then it would be very easy to identify who is political prisoner and who is not. So I think that the best answer to your question is the decision of Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, January 2013.
Second question. Last time you were here in Brussels, you said that there are no political...
So here you have the president of a country that no longer fears that it will be dishonorable to arrest the very people that had actually worked for the organization that Azerbaijan now took over the chairmanship. But what we've also seen here is that this is not about Azerbaijan, perhaps unimportant for most of us country somewhere in the Caucasus. It is really about capturing our language and our institutions. If these are the standards, if there can be no political prisoners in Europe, if the term itself has no meaning, then what is the use of all the commissioners and human rights groups? What can we, the NGOs and civil society, do to shame anybody? So here, instead of helping, one of the most respected human rights bodies in Europe has actually become a shield behind which a regime has been carrying out its policy of repression. Well, here is what happens when you're beyond shame. A few weeks ago in Vienna, in the Hofburg, the Azerbaijani foreign minister presented the priorities of his presidency. At the very moment in which some of these human rights defenders were sentenced to between 6 and 8 years in jail in trumped-up fake court proceedings, the foreign minister talked about the priorities of the Azerbaijani presidency of the Council of Europe in the following terms: seminars on human rights education in Baku, seminars on youth, seminars on independence of the judiciary. And there will be delegates traveling there, and there will be speeches, and they will be staying in hotels close to the members of the regime. And they will be talking, and in the meantime, the real human rights defenders will languish in jail. The regime bets that these are just all complicated names in a faraway country, that we'll forget these media activists, the 8 young men who've just recently been sentenced. And the regime has, until now, succeeded. Now, here is what we try to do today and tomorrow. We try to launch what in the SI we've called a BHAG, a big, hairy, ambitious goal. We need to mobilize. I think the human rights organizations and democrats in all countries cannot allow this capture of our vocabulary. And so we mobilize for a Europe without political prisoners, to launch a campaign. We have some concrete ideas which are back there, which we hope to discuss. But the most important, of course, is the decision, first of all, that we actually think there is this crisis. Now let me close with some thanks. Thanks, first of all, of course, to Mr. Strässer, not only for helping us put this together, this event, but beyond that, for having fought that there is actually today a resolution on political prisoners, which was adopted in the Parliamentary Assembly, and which only hasn't yet been put to use. He won that vote in October 2012, and for us he's been an inspiration. So thanks a lot, Mr. Strässer, for this. And also to thank the many human rights defenders who've come here, too many to name individually, to thank our partners from the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and finally to thank all those who cannot be here, who've defended our values or defending our values in Russia, and Ukraine, and Belarus, and Azerbaijan. Let's hope that they hear what we are saying here, and let's hope that what we say and do will make a difference to them. And so I conclude with a quote from the courtroom speech of the youth organization NIDA, these 8 young people. And they actually put themselves consciously in May this year in court after weeks of hunger strike and about to be sentenced to 6 to 8 years in jail. They put themselves in a proud tradition that they wanted to remind everyone of, the tradition of traditional dissent. They quoted Solzhenitsyn, and they said Solzhenitsyn in his Live Not by Lies wrote about the despotic regime's dependence on everyone's participation in the lies. He wrote that the simplest and most accessible key to our self-neglect and liberation lies right here, personal non-participation in lies. And this is what NIDA does. Well, let's make sure that our organizations and our representatives and our societies don't participate in lies either, and help to make the vision of a Europe without political prisoners come true before too long. Thanks a lot. Let's start with the first panel. In 1961, an article appeared in the London Observer. It launched a movement that has transformed the world, and that is still with us, the international human rights movement. In this article, the author argued that there is a growing tendency, friends, relatives, and compatriots who are supposed to be intimidated. But in a strange way, this particular story is also reassuring, because our mechanisms worked. Shaming worked. It is clear what is right and wrong, and in the end, right prevailed. So what we just saw here is in many ways a very familiar story. Non-violent critics of an authoritarian regime, thugs sent to beat them up one day in a restaurant, fake charges in a court to put them in prison, an international mobilization on their behalf, an effort to shame the regime that put such critics in jail, and in the end, they are set free. For those who lost 60 months of freedom in jail, this will always remain a sad story. And it will always remain bitter memories for across the world to disguise the real reasons upon which non-conformists are put in jail. And he wrote that this indicates that governments are by no means indifferent to the pressure of outside opinion. And that when opinion is concentrated on one weak spot,